pavement outside the emergency room was still warm from the day when a police officer drove his knee into the back of a black man in wrinkled hospital scrubs and forced his cheek against the concrete. The man did not fight. He lay still, his arms wrenched behind him, and a few feet away, knocked loose in the struggle, his hospital ID badge lay face up in the dirt beside a small black pager that had just begun to shriek. A sharp, insistent electronic scream that neither officer bothered to look at. In the distance, a siren was growing louder, closing fast on the ambulance bay, carrying a dying man toward the one set of hands that could save him. Officer Jake Turner ground his knee down harder and told the man to stop resisting, certain he'd just tackled some strung-out addict prowling the parking lot. What Turner did not know, what the screaming pager on the ground was trying to tell him, was that the man he was cuffing was the chief of trauma surgery at the hospital behind them, that the siren in the distance was carrying a police officer with a bullet in his chest, and that in about 4 minutes, the only person alive who could save that officer's life would be the man Turner was pinning to the ground. Before we find out who the man in the handcuffs really was, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive back into the story. To understand how a routine parking lot stop nearly killed a police officer, you have to rewind about 10 minutes to the moment Dr. Nathaniel Pierce stepped outside to breathe. Nathaniel Pierce was 50 years old, a tall, broad-shouldered black man with close-cut graying hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the deep, bone-tired calm of a person who had spent a career staying steady while other people's worst days unfolded on a table in front of him. He was the chief of trauma surgery at County General, the most senior surgeon in the busiest emergency department in the region, and he had just finished the 12th hour of a brutal shift. He looked nothing like the title. His green scrubs were wrinkled and stained from a long day, the drawstring loose, the sleeves pushed up over his forearms. His hospital ID badge, which normally hung from a lanyard around his neck, had flipped around and tucked itself down inside his collar somewhere during the last surgery, out of sight. His eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. He had stepped out of the doors near the ambulance bay for exactly one reason: to stand in the night air for 5 minutes, away from the beeping and the blood, and remember what it felt like to breathe. Because that was the truth about Nathaniel Pierce that no one looking at him in that parking lot would have guessed. The tired man in the rumpled scrubs had, in 22 years, put more shattered bodies back together than he could count. Gunshot wounds, car wrecks, industrial accidents. The cases that came in coding, the ones other surgeons called unsurvivable. His hands were the last line between a lot of people in the morgue, and everyone who worked at County General knew it. On this shift, he was the only trauma surgeon in the building. There was a reason Nathaniel Pierce took the oath as seriously as he did, and it went back a long way. He had grown up poor, on the wrong side of a city that had a habit of looking at boys like him and seeing trouble before it saw anything else. He'd been stopped himself, more than once, as a young man, made to explain what he was doing in his own neighborhood or someone else's. His pockets emptied on the hood of a car while he swallowed his anger and said, "Yes, sir," and "No, sir," until they let him go. He knew from the inside exactly what it felt like to be decided about before you opened your mouth. He had chosen medicine in part because of it, because an operating table was the one place he had ever found where none of that mattered, where the only questions that counted were what's bleeding and how do I stop it, where a body was just a body and a life was just a life, regardless of what anyone had assumed about the person attached to it. He'd built his whole career on that idea, that when someone was dying in front of you, who they were and what you thought of them simply fell away, and all that was left was the work. It was, in a way, the fairest room he'd ever found. He had no idea he was about to be reminded, in the cruelest way possible, how unfair the rooms outside it could still be. He walked a little way across the lot toward his car to grab a phone charger he'd left on the seat. His badge tucked out of sight, his mind foggy with fatigue. He clipped the trauma pager to the waistband of his scrubs out of pure habit, the way he always did, even on a break, because a chief of trauma is never really off. He had no idea that habit was about to save a man's life. And he had no idea that two officers sitting in a cruiser at the edge of the lot had just decided he was a criminal. Officer Jake Turner was 34, 10 years on the force, and he had spent most of the evening parked at the edge of the county general lot, filling out reports and complaining to his partner about how nothing ever happened on the slow shifts. He was a big man who liked the feeling of being the one in control, and boredom made him restless in a way that tended to end badly for whoever crossed his path next. His partner, Officer Danny Cole, was 27, only 2 years in, still young enough to feel the difference between what they were supposed to do and what Turner actually did, but not yet brave enough to say so. Cole had learned that the easiest way to survive a shift with Turner was to keep his mouth shut and nod. Turner's eyes tracked the tired man in scrubs walking across the dark lot toward a parked car. And in that instant, Turner's boredom found something to do. He did not think, "That's a hospital worker on a break." He did not think, "Those are scrubs. He probably works here." In the half-second his eyes landed on Nathaniel Pierce. Turner had already built a story, and it was the story he'd been hoping for all night. A black man, alone, in the dark, at the edge of a parking lot, moving toward a car. In Turner's mind, that added up to exactly one thing: a junkie casing vehicles, or a car thief, or an addict who'd wandered over from the ER looking for something to steal. Every piece of that picture came from the man's skin and the dark in Turner's own hunger for something to do, and not one piece came from a fact. The scrubs, if he'd let himself see them, told the true story. He didn't let himself see them. "Well, well," Turner muttered, unclipping his seatbelt. "Look at this guy, casing the lot." He was already opening the door. "Come on." "Jake," Cole said, hesitating, squinting through the windshield. Those are scrubs, man. He probably works at the hospital. We're literally parked at the hospital." "Or he stole them, or he's using them to blend in," Turner said, the way a man talks when he's already decided and just wants his partner to stop slowing him down. "You always give these guys too much credit. Watch and learn." He crossed the lot fast, his boots loud on the asphalt, his hand already resting on his belt. Cole followed a step behind, uneasy. "Hey," Turner barked. "You, stop right there. What are you doing out here?" Nathaniel turned slowly, blinking behind his glasses, his exhausted brain taking an extra second to register that the aggression was aimed at him. "Evening, officers," he said, his voice a low, even baritone worn rough by the long shift. "I'm just grabbing a charger out of my car. I work here." "Yeah? What do you do here?" Turner said, stepping in close, crowding him, eyes flicking over the wrinkled scrubs like they were a costume. "I'm a surgeon," Nathaniel said. "My ID's right." He reached toward his collar, where the badge had tucked itself out of sight, meaning only to fish it out and show them. "Whoa! Hands! Keep your hands where I can see them!" Turner's voice cracked like a whip, his palm slamming down under the grip of his holstered weapon. Nathaniel froze, both hands coming up slowly, open and empty. "Easy, easy. It's a badge. It's around my neck. It just flipped around. I'm reaching for my hospital ID." "I didn't tell you to reach for anything," Turner snapped. And there it was, the exact moment a tired surgeon on a 5-minute break became, in a bored officer's mind, a suspect resisting. Now, here is what Officer Jake Turner could not have known as he stood in that dark lot with his hand on his gun, and what the exhausted man in front of him had said plainly and been ignored. The man Turner had decided was a junkie. Casing cars was Dr. Nathaniel Pierce, the chief of trauma surgery, the single most senior surgeon in the hospital directly behind them, and the only trauma surgeon on duty that entire night. If a critical patient came through those ambulance bay doors in the next hour, there was exactly one person in the building qualified to open a chest and stop the bleeding, and Turner had his hand on a weapon pointed at him, and it was so much worse than that, in a way that turned the whole scene into something almost unbearable. Because at that very moment, a mile and a half away, another police cruiser was screaming through red lights with its own emergency on board. Officer Sean Doyle, 30 years old, from a neighboring precinct, had walked into what should have been a routine call and taken a bullet high in the chest. His partner hadn't waited for the ambulance. He'd loaded Doyle into the back of the cruiser himself and was flooring it toward the nearest trauma center, County General, while dispatch radioed ahead. If Turner had been listening to his own radio instead of performing for his partner, he'd have heard it. Officer down, gunshot wound to the chest. En route to County General. ETA 4 minutes. The words were in the air around him. He never heard them because he was too busy deciding that a black man in scrubs was a criminal. That is the terrible gravity of what you're watching. 2 cops were about to beat and handcuff the one surgeon who could save the life of a third cop, who was, in that very moment, bleeding out in the back of a speeding car and racing toward the man on the ground. Every second Turner spent grinding Nathaniel Pierce into the pavement was a second stolen from a dying officer's life, and Turner had no idea he was stealing it. If your stomach is in a knot right now, hit that like button and subscribe, because the moment these officers realize what they've done and who they need is coming, and it is going to hit hard. Inside the emergency department, the machine was already spinning up. The radio call had come into the charge nurse's station, and Gloria Ruiz, a veteran nurse who had run the ER floor for 15 years, was moving fast, calling out orders, prepping the main trauma bay for an incoming gunshot wound to the chest. Blood was being pulled, the trauma team was assembling, and Ruiz was doing the one thing that mattered most and finding it impossible. She needed her trauma surgeon, and she couldn't find him. She paged him. Out in the dark parking lot, clipped to the waistband of a set of wrinkled scrubs, a small black pager began to scream. Nathaniel heard it. His whole body responded to it before his tired mind even caught up. The reflex of 22 years. That specific tone meant trauma activation. That tone meant someone was dying and the team needed him now. "That's my pager," he said, his voice suddenly sharp and urgent, the fatigue burning off in an instant. "Officers, listen to me carefully. I am the trauma surgeon on call. That page means there is a critical patient inbound. I have to go inside right now, or someone is going to die. Please." "Nobody's going anywhere," Turner said. To Turner, the man's sudden urgency wasn't a surgeon hearing a trauma page. It was a suspect getting agitated, looking for an excuse to run. The pager screaming on the man's hip wasn't evidence he was telling the truth. It was noise, one more thing that didn't fit the story, and therefore didn't count. Nathaniel felt the situation tipping and made one more attempt to stop it, keeping his voice as level and unthreatening as 22 years of hard nights had taught him. "Officer, I am not resisting. I am not going to resist. But that pager means a human being is dying, and I am the only surgeon who can help them. Every second you spend on this is a second they don't have. I am begging you, not for me, for whoever is in that trauma bay. Let me do my job." It was the calmest, most reasonable plea a man could make. To Turner, it was just more words from a suspect he'd stopped listening to. "I said keep your hands still," Turner barked, and when Nathaniel instinctively turned his body toward the doors, toward the patient, toward the thing his entire life had trained him to run to, Turner read the movement as flight and moved. He grabbed Nathaniel by the arm and wrenched it behind his back. Nathaniel was 50 years old and bone-tired. He had no chance to brace. Turner used his weight to drive the surgeon down against the hood of the nearest car and then to the pavement, hard, forcing him onto his stomach on the warm concrete. "Stop resisting," Turner shouted, for the benefit of his own body camera, though the man beneath him was not resisting at all. The impact knocked Nathaniel's glasses askew and jarred the lanyard free from his collar so that his hospital ID badge finally swung out into the open. And then, as Turner planted a knee in his back, the lanyard caught and snapped, and the badge skittered across the pavement to land face up a few feet away. On it, clearly printed under a photo of the man being cuffed, were the words that would have ended all of this. Nathaniel Pierce, M.D., Chief of Trauma Surgery. It lay there in the dirt, and neither officer looked at it. Beside it, knocked loose from his waistband, the trauma pager lay on the concrete, still shrieking its sharp, insistent alarm into the night. A dying man, calling for the surgeon lying handcuffed on the ground. Danny Cole stood 2 feet away and watched all of it, and something in his chest twisted. He could see the badge on the ground. He could read it from where he stood, the photo, the name, the title. He could hear the pager, that specific relentless tone that even he, a cop with no medical training, understood meant emergency. He could see that the man Turner was kneeling on wasn't fighting, wasn't a threat, was just lying there pleading in a voice that was somehow still calm, still reasonable, still trying to help them understand. Every instinct Cole had was screaming that this was wrong, that they had made a terrible mistake, that they needed to stop right now. And he said nothing. He stood frozen, caught between what he knew and the senior officer he was afraid to contradict. And in the years to come, the thing that would haunt him was not what Turner did. It was the silence of those few seconds when he, Danny Cole, knew better and did nothing. Seconds a man in a car was bleeding through. Seconds that could have been the difference between life and death for someone he'd sworn to protect. "Please," Nathaniel said, his cheek pressed to the pavement, his voice tight but still controlled, still trying to reach them through the adrenaline. "Listen to the pager. That is a trauma call. My badge is right there on the ground, 2 feet from your boot. Look at it. Please, just look at it. There is a patient who needs me. Yeah, and I need you to shut up," Turner grunted, cinching the handcuffs tight around the surgeon's wrists. Behind him, Danny Cole shifted uneasily, his eyes going to the badge on the ground, to the screaming pager, a sick feeling starting to build in his gut. He opened his mouth, and then the night lit up. A police cruiser came tearing around the corner into the ambulance bay. No ambulance, just a patrol car driven by a frantic officer, its horn blaring. It skidded to a stop at the ER doors 50 feet away, and the driver leapt out screaming for help, and the doors of the emergency department burst open as a team rushed out with a gurney, and Gloria Ruiz came out with them at a dead run, scanning the dark for the one person she needed and could not find, her trauma surgeon. Her eyes swept the ambulance bay, the doors, the lot. And they landed on the site of Dr. Nathaniel Pierce, Chief of Trauma Surgery, face down on the pavement in handcuffs with a police officer's knee in his back. For one frozen second, Gloria Ruiz could not process what she was seeing. Then she understood all of it at once, and the horror hit her like ice water. If your heart is pounding, hit like and subscribe right now, because what this nurse does next changes everything. And there is a man in the back of that car with seconds to spare. "Get off of him!" Ruiz screamed, sprinting across the lot. "What are you doing? That's Dr. Pierce. That's the Chief of Trauma Surgery. Get off of him. We have a patient dying right now." Turner's head snapped up. "Ma'am, stay back. That man is the only surgeon in this building who can save the officer in that car." Ruiz was on them now, grabbing the badge off the pavement and shoving it in Turner's face, her finger stabbing at the words. "Read it. Nathaniel Pierce, Chief of Trauma Surgery. You've got your knee on the one person who can save your own. That's a cop in that car. Gunshot wound. He is going to bleed out in the next few minutes, and this is the man who can stop it." The words hit Turner like a physical blow. His eyes went from the badge to the screaming pager to the frantic officer at the ER doors screaming that his partner was dying, to the man beneath his knee. And the whole false story he'd built collapsed at once, replaced by a cold, plunging horror. The scrubs, the pager, the "I'm a surgeon." All of it had been true. All of it. Every single thing the man had said in that calm, exhausted voice, every fact Turner had waved away as a lie, had been exactly, precisely true. And Turner had heard all of it, out loud, and chosen not to believe a word, because believing it would have meant seeing the man in front of him as something other than what he'd already decided he was. Now the consequences of that choice were arriving all at once, and they were monstrous. A surgeon assaulted, a trauma call ignored, and a wounded officer somewhere behind those doors running out of the minutes this man could have been using to save him. "Oh my God," Cole breathed behind him. "Get the cuffs off him, now!" Ruiz roared. Turner fumbled for his key, his hands suddenly clumsy, and unlocked the handcuffs. The steel came away from Nathaniel's wrists, leaving raw red marks. And Nathaniel Pierce did not waste a single second on the two officers. He did not shout, or curse, or demand an apology. He shoved himself up off the pavement, grabbed his badge and his glasses from Ruiz's hand, and was already moving toward the ambulance bay at a run, his exhaustion gone, his voice snapping into the hard, clear rhythm of command. "Gloria, talk to me!" he called as he ran. "What have we got?" "Male, 30, single GSW to the left chest, hypotensive, Taichi." They scooped and ran. Ruiz fired back, matching his stride. "Bay 1's ready, ONEG is up, teams assembled. Let's go! Move! Move!" They rushed through the doors together, the gurney with the bleeding officer crashing in beside them, and the emergency department swallowed them up. What happened over the next 90 minutes in that trauma bay was the thing Nathaniel Pierce had spent 22 years learning to do. Officer Sean Doyle's blood pressure bottomed out twice on the table. The bullet had torn through the chest and nicked a vessel, and he was drowning in his own bleeding. And the tired, bruised surgeon, who had been face down on the pavement 10 minutes earlier, stood over him with steady hands and opened his chest and found the bleeding and stopped it, calling out orders in a calm, unhurried voice while the monitors screamed, pulling a man back from the edge that most surgeons would have lost. The bullet had entered high on the left side of the chest and torn a path through tissue and vessel, and Doyle was drowning from the inside, his lungs and the space around them filling with blood faster than the team could keep up. Twice the monitors flatlined toward a scream, and twice Nathaniel brought him back, his hands moving with a speed that didn't look like hurry, calling for units of blood, for suction, for a clamp, his voice never rising above the calm, carrying register that told a panicking room everything was under control, even when it wasn't. He opened the chest. He found the torn vessel in a field of red, working by feel and by 22 years of muscle memory, and he got his fingers on the bleeding and held it while the team caught up. And then, stitch by careful stitch, he closed the hole that was killing Sean Doyle. It was the kind of save that separates a good surgeon from a great one, performed by a man with a bruised jaw and raw wrists who, 40 minutes earlier, had been face down on a parking lot. He did it without once mentioning what had happened outside. He did it for a man wearing the same uniform as the officer who had ground his face into the concrete. He did it because a long time ago he had taken an oath, and because to Nathaniel Pierce the oath did not have an exception for the days when the world treated him like a criminal. He did it because the person on his table was a human being who was dying, and that was the only fact in the room that mattered to him. If you're still holding your breath, let it out and hit that like button and subscribe, because the man who was face down on the pavement is about to do the most extraordinary thing in this entire story. The team around him had worked the way a good trauma team works, a nurse anticipating the next instrument before he asked, the anesthesiologist calling numbers in a steady voice, someone hanging another unit of blood, all of it orbiting the calm center of a surgeon who never once raised his voice. They had all seen, or heard by now, what had happened to him in the parking lot. Nobody mentioned it. There was no room in that bay for anything but the man on the table. But more than one of them would say later that they had never seen Nathaniel Pierce more locked in than he was that night, as though he had taken everything that had just been done to him and simply set it down outside the door, because it had no place in a room where a life was being saved. At 11:40 that night, Dr. Nathaniel Pierce stepped back from the table, stripped off his bloody gloves, and said the words the whole room was waiting for. "He's stable. He's gonna make it. Good work, everybody." Officer Sean Doyle was going to live, because the man two of his brothers in uniform had beaten in a parking lot had saved him. Out in the ambulance bay, the 10 minutes while Nathaniel worked had been their own kind of reckoning. Officer Jake Turner had stood by his cruiser in a daze, the enormity of what he'd done settling over him in waves. He had beaten and handcuffed a chief of surgery, on camera, while a wounded police officer bled in a car 40 feet away. And that surgeon had gotten up off the pavement Turner had put him on and run inside to save that officer's life. There was no version of the story Turner could tell himself, now that made him anything other than what he was. Danny Cole, the younger officer, had not stood in a daze. He'd been the one to call it in, not the sanitized version, but the real one. He'd gotten on his radio and told his supervisor exactly what had happened, that they'd taken down a hospital surgeon who'd identified himself, who'd had a badge and a trauma pager, who'd begged them to let him go to a dying patient. Cole was young, but something in him had refused this time to help build the cover story. He'd seen the badge on the ground. He'd heard the pager scream. He wasn't going to pretend he hadn't. By the time Nathaniel finished in the trauma bay, a police supervisor and the hospital's night administrator were both waiting for him, and the mood in the corridor was funereal. Nathaniel came out of the bay still in his bloody scrubs, pulled off his surgical cap, and faced them with a calm that was, if anything, more unsettling than anger would have been. His wrists were ringed raw where the cuffs had bitten in. There was a scrape on his cheek from the pavement and a bruise blooming along his jaw. The officer will live, he told them first, because to him, that came before everything else. He'll need follow-up, but he'll live. Then he turned to the police supervisor, and his voice stayed level and clinical, the voice of a man making a record. "I want to be very clear about what I need to happen now," he said. "I want a preservation order on both of those officers' body camera footage, effective immediately. Nothing overwritten, nothing deleted. I want the audio from their radios and from dispatch. I want the hospital's exterior security cameras from the ambulance bay and the lot pulled and secured. My badge and my trauma pager were on the ground beside me the entire time. Every second of what happened out there is recorded from several directions, and I want all of it preserved before anyone writes a single word of a report." "Dr. Pierce," the supervisor started, "I want you to know we take this extremely—" "I'm not finished," Nathaniel said, not unkindly, but with the flat authority of a man who ran a department of his own. "I just spent 90 minutes saving the life of a police officer. I did it while bruised from being thrown to the ground by two of his colleagues who refused to look at the badge around my neck or listen to the pager on my hip telling them a man was dying. I did it because it's my job and my oath, and I'd do it again. But I did not save that man's life so that this could quietly disappear. It is not going to disappear. Am I understood?" The supervisor understood. Completely. The hospital, to its credit, did not treat what happened to its chief of surgery as an embarrassment to be smoothed over. A colleague cleaned and documented the scrapes on Nathaniel's face and the raw abrasions ringing his wrists, photographing each one for the record, because the injuries themselves were evidence. The night administrator preserved the exterior camera footage before the sun came up, and word moved through the emergency department the way it always does, in low voices at the nurses' station and the break room, the staff learning that the tired man they had watched walk out for 5 minutes of air had been thrown to the ground and cuffed by police in their own ambulance bay, and had then come straight back in and saved a life without so much as a word about it. The people who worked alongside Nathaniel Pierce had always respected him. After that night, something in that respect deepened into something closer to awe, and not because of the surgery, remarkable as it was. It was because of the thing he'd done that no oath strictly required. He had refused to let the worst treatment of his life change, by a single degree, the care he gave to a stranger who shared a uniform with the men who delivered it. The investigation that followed was short because the evidence was overwhelming and because one of the two officers refused to lie. Jake Turner did what officers like Jake Turner had always been able to do. He wrote a report that told a different story than the one that happened. In his version, the man in the lot had been acting suspiciously, had reached toward his waistband in a furtive manner, had physically resisted, and attempted to flee, making a hard takedown necessary for officer safety. It was the language he'd used a dozen times before, the language that had always turned an ugly stop into a justified one on paper. He was betting, the way he'd always bet, that his word in a report would outweigh a suspect's complaint. But this time, there were two things Turner's report couldn't survive. The first was the video. His own body camera had recorded the entire encounter. Nathaniel calm and cooperative, identifying himself as a surgeon, announcing that he was reaching for the badge around his neck, the pager screaming a trauma alert, Nathaniel begging them to look at the badge 2 feet from Turner's boot while a knee pinned him to the ground. There was no furtive reach. There was no resistance. There was no attempt to flee. The camera showed a tired man telling the truth and 2 officers refusing to hear it. Turner's careful report and the footage from his own chest told 2 completely different stories, and only one of them was real. The second thing Turner's report couldn't survive was his partner. When Internal Affairs sat Danny Cole down, they laid out the 2 roads in front of him plainly. He could back up Turner's report and become part of it, or he could tell them what actually happened. Cole was young, he had a career ahead of him, and he knew exactly what happened to cops who broke ranks. But he had stood in that parking lot and watched a man beg for the chance to go save a dying person. And he had seen the badge on the ground, and he had heard the pager scream, and he had done nothing. He was not going to compound it by lying now. He sat in the small windowless room across from the investigators, and he thought about the badge on the ground and the pager screaming and the calm, reasonable voice of a man begging to be allowed to go, save someone. And he thought about his own silence, and he decided he was done being the kind of officer who stayed quiet. Cole told them the truth, all of it. He described the approach, how Turner had spotted a black man near the cars and decided, before a word was exchanged, that he was a criminal. He described Pierce identifying himself as a surgeon, calmly, more than once. He described the pager going off, that unmistakable trauma tone, and Pierce begging to be allowed inside because a life depended on it. He described the badge hitting the pavement and lying there face up while Turner drove a knee into a man who wasn't resisting. And he described his own silence. He didn't spare himself. The seconds he'd stood frozen and said nothing when he'd known, all the way down, that they were making a terrible mistake. The investigators wrote it all down. When Cole finished, he felt sick and lighter at the same time. The specific feeling of a person who has finally told the truth about something he was afraid of. That Pierce had identified himself immediately. That he'd tried to show his ID. That the pager had been going off the whole time. That Turner had decided the man was a criminal before he ever got out of the car and had refused every chance to find out he was wrong. That there had been no resistance, and that Turner's report was a fabrication. Between the body camera footage and Cole's statement, there was nothing left to investigate. Jake Turner had beaten and falsely arrested the chief of trauma surgery, obstructed him from reaching a dying patient, a wounded police officer no less, and then filed a false report to cover it up. Every one of those was its own kind of catastrophe. Together, they were the end. Jake Turner was terminated from the department. The body camera footage and his fabricated report made any other outcome impossible, and this time, the usual machinery that protected officers like him simply wasn't there. Not for a man caught on his own camera beating a surgeon away from a dying cop, and then lying about it in writing. His union declined to spend its capital on a case that clean. There was a criminal referral for the assault and the false report, and a civil rights claim from Nathaniel's attorneys that the city, staring at the same footage everyone else had seen, had no appetite to fight. It settled, and the settlement was substantial, and every dollar of it traced back to the moment an officer decided a set of scrubs was a costume. And in a detail that told you everything about how completely the truth had come out, One of the people who gave a statement supporting the surgeon's account was Sean Doyle himself, the wounded officer, once he was well enough to speak, insisting on the record that the man his colleagues had beaten in that parking lot was the man who had saved his life, and that what had been done to Dr. Pierce was indefensible. When the officer you nearly let die is testifying against you, there is no story left to tell. At 34, 10 years into a career, he'd used to decide who did and didn't belong in the dark at the edge of a parking lot. Jake Turner was out of law enforcement, and because the termination was for cause and documented on video, he was not going to talk his way into another badge. Danny Cole kept his. It was not a comfortable thing. Telling the truth about your partner never is, and there were people in the department who looked at him differently afterward. But the surgeon whose life he'd failed to protect that night, and the investigators who had watched him choose honesty over the code, both understood what it had cost him to do it. Cole would carry the parking lot with him for the rest of his career, the memory of standing frozen while a man begged, and he made a quiet promise to himself about the kind of cop he was going to be from then on. The kind who looked and listened and asked the question before he ever decided who someone was. It is a strange thing to say that a disaster made a better officer, but it did. Cole had seen, up close and horribly, exactly what the other road led to, and he never took it again. There was one person that night whose quick thinking never made it into the headlines, and Nathaniel made sure she was not forgotten. Gloria Ruiz, the charge nurse, had done in 10 seconds what 2 trained officers had failed to do in 10 minutes. She had looked at the man on the ground and actually seen him, recognized her chief of surgery, grabbed the badge off the pavement, and put the truth in front of everyone loudly enough that it could not be ignored. If she had come out of those doors even a minute later, or hesitated, or assumed the officers must know what they were doing, Sean Doyle would very likely have died, waiting for a surgeon who was pinned to the concrete 40 feet away. Nathaniel told the hospital administration exactly that in writing, and made certain the record reflected that a nurse's willingness to trust her own eyes over a police officer's assumptions was the hinge the whole night had turned on. The department, for its part, did not simply fire one officer and move on. The footage from that parking lot was too clean and too damning for that, and the near death of one of their own at the hands of their own negligence had rattled people all the way up the chain. Turner's body camera video became something the department could not look away from, and eventually it became a training case, shown to officers as the textbook example of how a stop goes catastrophically wrong when a cop decides who someone is before gathering a single fact. Instructors would freeze it on the frame of the badge lying face up in the dirt, 2 feet from Turner's boot, and ask the room a simple question. How many chances did this officer have to just look? The answer was always the same. All of them. He'd had all of them and taken none. There was a civil rights settlement, and it was substantial. The kind of number a city pays when the footage is this clear and the victim is this sympathetic. Nathaniel didn't keep the fight quiet, and he didn't keep the money to himself. A good portion of it went to a program that trained emergency responders and hospital staff to de-escalate exactly the kind of encounter that had nearly killed a patient that night. But he was honest, always, about the limits of what his own case could fix. He had survived and been vindicated because he'd turned out to be the chief of trauma surgery, with a nurse who knew his face and a pager screaming proof of who he was. He never pretended that was justice available to everyone. It was justice available to him on that particular night because of who he happened to be, and he spent a fair amount of the rest of his career trying to widen that door for the people who would never get his lucky break. As for Nathaniel Pierce, he went home near dawn that night, slept a few hours, and came back the next day and did his job. He didn't tell the story around the hospital. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew, and the way they looked at him. The man who'd been beaten in the lot and then walked straight in and saved the life of a cop carried more weight than anything he could have said. He treated it, characteristically, as simply the thing that had happened on the way to the thing that mattered, which was the patient on the table. But there was one more part of the story still to come, and it started 3 days later when Officer Sean Doyle opened his eyes. Sean Doyle woke up in the intensive care unit with a tube in his chest, a scar he'd carry forever, and no memory of anything after the gunshot. His partner was at his bedside, and over the next day in pieces, Doyle learned how close he'd come and how he'd been pulled back. And then he learned the rest of it. He learned that the surgeon who had opened his chest and stopped the bleeding and saved his life had done it 10 minutes after 2 police officers, men wearing Doyle's own uniform, had thrown that same surgeon to the pavement, handcuffed him, and tried to stop him from coming inside. He learned that the man who saved him had gotten up off the ground where the cops had put him, bruised and bleeding from his own face, and run straight to the trauma bay to save a cop. Sean Doyle was not a man who cried easily. He cried in that ICU bed because he understood, in a way that only someone whose life was the thing on the scale could understand, exactly what he'd been given and exactly what it had almost cost. When he was strong enough, he asked to see Dr. Pierce, and Nathaniel came in a fresh set of scrubs and stood at the foot of the bed of the police officer he'd saved. For a moment, neither of them knew quite what to say. Then Doyle spoke, his voice rough from the tube. "They told me what they did to you, outside, before you." He stopped, his jaw working. "You had every reason on earth to take your time coming in. Or to let somebody else." "There was nobody else," Nathaniel said quietly. "And even if there had been, that's not how it works. You were dying. That's the only thing that was true in that room. Everything that happened in the parking lot stayed in the parking lot. It had nothing to do with you." "It should have mattered," Doyle said. "What they did, it should have mattered, and you didn't let it. I don't." He shook his head, overwhelmed. "I don't know how to thank a man for saving my life 10 minutes after my own people did that to him." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped closer and put a hand on the younger man's shoulder. "You want to thank me?" he said. "Then be the kind of officer who looks at the person in front of him before he decides who they are. That's it. That's the whole thing. The 2 men who put me on that pavement had 100 chances to just look at my badge, at my scrubs, at my face. And they didn't take a single one because they'd already decided what a man like me had to be. If getting a second chance at your life means anything, let it mean you'll never be one of those men. That's worth more to me than any thank you." Doyle nodded slowly, tears in his eyes, and made the promise. And by every account of the officer he became afterward, he kept it. Sean Doyle recovered. It took months of healing and rehab, but he walked out of County General on his own 2 feet. And the first thing he did on his way out was stop by the surgical floor to shake Nathaniel Pierce's hand one more time. His recovery was not simple. There were setbacks, a second procedure, weeks where breathing itself was work. Through all of it, the story of how he'd survived sat with him, that he was alive because of a man his own colleagues had beaten in a parking lot, a man who'd gotten up off the ground and saved him anyway. It changed something in Doyle that no lecture ever could have. His fellow officers came to visit, and some of them, quietly, didn't know what to say about what Turner had done, and a few of them, to their shame, wanted to talk around it. Doyle wouldn't let them. He made a point, from his hospital bed, of telling anyone who came through the door exactly who had saved his life and exactly how that man had been treated first. He had a debt he intended to pay by refusing, for the rest of his career, to let it be swept quietly under the rug. The hospital wanted to make a thing of it. There was talk of a ceremony, a plaque, a write-up in the local paper about the surgeon who had saved a police officer's life after being assaulted in the parking lot. Nathaniel quietly declined all of it. He didn't want to be a headline. He was uncomfortable with the way the story got told, where he became a kind of saint for doing what he considered the baseline of his job. "I stopped to bleed," he'd say when people tried to make him a hero. "That's Tuesday. Any surgeon in my department would have done the same." He was more interested in the parts of the story people found less inspiring, the part where 2 officers looked at a man and saw a criminal, and how ordinary and easy that had been for them, and how many times a version of it must happen to people who don't happen to have a badge in their collar and a nurse who knows their face. Because that was the thing Nathaniel Pierce could never quite let go of. He had survived that night and been vindicated and even honored for one reason and one reason only. He had turned out to be somebody. The chief of surgery. The man who saved the cop. The story worked, and the cameras mattered, and the truth won because the man on the pavement had a title big enough to make the world pay attention. But he had spent his whole life around people who didn't. He thought about all the tired men in wrinkled clothes at the edges of parking lots who got thrown to the ground and did not turn out to be the chief of anything, whose pagers weren't screaming a trauma alert, for whom no nurse came running with a badge, and about whom no video ever went viral. The only difference between Nathaniel and those men on the concrete that night had been who he happened to be. The stop was the same. The assumption was the same. The knee in the back was the same. He just got a happy ending, and most of them didn't, and he never let himself forget it. And that's the thing to carry out of this one. Not a single second of what happened outside that emergency room had to happen. All Jake Turner had to do, at any point, was look at the scrubs, at the badge on the ground, at the pager screaming a trauma alert, at the tired man telling him the plain truth over and over, instead of the story he'd written before he ever stepped out of his car. Green scrubs instead of a suit. A black man alone in the dark instead of a face he'd decided to trust. That was all the evidence he needed to throw a surgeon to the pavement and nearly let a wounded officer die in the process. The cruelest irony of the whole night is that the man they treated as worthless turned out to be the most valuable person in that parking lot to them, specifically, the one who held a fellow officer's life in his hands. But he shouldn't have had to be. He shouldn't have had to be the chief of surgery for it to be wrong to beat him. A man doesn't have to turn out to be somebody important for the assumption that he's a criminal to be a terrible way to see another human being. That's the part worth sitting with. Nathaniel Pierce got justice because he was extraordinary. Everybody deserves it just for being a person. So, let me ask you honestly, because I read every comment. Have you ever been looked at and instantly decided about, written off by the way you were dressed, or the color of your skin, or where you were standing, before you said a single word? And be honest with yourself for a moment. How often do we quietly do the same thing to a stranger, and just never find out we were wrong? Tell me below. That conversation is the whole reason a story like this matters. If this one moved you, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so the next story finds you. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.